Zenith Trajectory, the fourth part of the Shackled City adventure path, which was released in Dungeon Magazine 102. This adventure was written for character levels between 6 through 8. It is a 33-page adventure. You can see Zenith here, a dwarf who the players will attempt to rescue in this adventure, on his seat for a reason. As you go down here to the beginning of the adventure, it's written by David Noonan, with artwork by Tom Baxa, Jeff Carlisle, and Mark Nelson, with cartography by Christopher West. Now, as usual with these adventures, you get a lot of background on the city of Cauldron, where these adventures and the whole campaign, for the most part, takes place, which is great and adds a lot for a DM, so they have a lot of material to work from. You go further down here. You have information on the town, as usual, and many of them important characters, which, again, these may be important NPCs that the DM has already used or could use. And again, basic information on Cauldron and some of the creatures in it, and at least in 3rd edition, as the adventure came out of 3rd edition, how to raise the level of the adventure or lower it. I ran this adventure, like the entire Shackled City campaign, in 5th edition, so I can give some insight on how to convert it, and it's fairly easy to do so. Now, like before, you get a rumor table, which I would recommend using to its greatest ability. Throw in rumors whenever you can, when the players are at the Drunken Morkoth, or down by the Lakeside Cantina, or maybe just hearing rumors in the streets, or who knows. Now, this adventure primarily deals with a Kuatoan fortress in the Underdark called Bal Hamatug, which involves the beholder, who is posing essentially as the Lord Mayor of the city as a human, testing the players or their characters out on a mission, more so to maybe use them for his own benefit, or to see how powerful they might be and whether or not he can destroy them. He is a beholder, so it could be either or. And of course, the plot of this adventure involves a 5,000 gold reward to rescue the dwarf Zenith Splinter Shield from that location. Now, in the very beginning of the adventure, when you get past the rumors, the opening chapter is called Hulk Smash, because it involves an Umber Hulk that smashes through a wall. And this is part of Valanthru's test. As you get here, it suggests a fiendish Umber Hulk. This is a modified version of an Umber Hulk from 3rd edition. If you're running in 5th edition, you don't necessarily need to make it fiendish. A regular Umber Hulk should probably be fine at this level. There will be also some NPC. There's several crowds around in this area when this attack takes place, including members of the City Watch, random NPCs, some other people that are just kind of nearby that can help out with the situation. The attack takes place on the north end of the city, on Magma Avenue. You can see where the crowds essentially are in various locations. Players will probably be pretty familiar with the Slippery Eel Tavern. I mean, most of the taverns in Cauldron, the players will probably have visited by now, or at least would have some knowledge about them. You could even use some of these little shops for little side stories in the adventure. Mavu's Imports, for example. The merchant Mavu is somewhat of a character in this adventure and becomes more important as time goes on. My players, for example, after this particular encounter, went over to the Meat on a Stick shop and bought some meat. Anyways, as you're going through here, you see some other people that just happen to be there, including some gnomes, which might help out in the fight. But the Umber Hulk pops out, attacks people, the player characters. It pops out of an old warehouse, by the way. Attacks people, the player characters are meant to destroy it. And this happens openly in the streets, which of course makes the city look more chaotic than it's been and all that. And you get some information on the City Watch as well. As you're going through this particular part of the adventure, I'll note, by the way, it shows the different rounds when different factions come into play during this battle, like when the City Watch show up, when someone named Kira gets themselves involved, and the agents of the city, when all that happens. At the end of this situation, the player characters are given a card from an NPC named Celeste for a well-dressed social event, which clashes a little bit with the violence in the streets, but it's kind of interesting, you know. But she's an agent of Valantru's and part of his test, of course, and the players don't know this. They're given this card. They're invited to this opportunity at well, the social club called the Cusp of Sunrise, again on Magma Avenue on the other side of town. Players are suggested to dress well and to behave like nobles. My campaign had a centaur barbarian who I think he put on a bow tie and he didn't put on pants. He was a centaur. And they didn't behave that well when they went there. But I think a lot of player characters, depending on who they are, will probably act however they want in this situation. And I think this adventure, this section of the adventure, is designed to be like that. It's meant to be pompous and ridiculous with the nobles of the city, and then the player characters will probably have a lot of fun with that. And my player characters did. We also had a very noble bard who was, well, he was up to no good, to one way or another. Anyways, your group will do what they do. As they enter this situation, they have the opportunity to mingle at this club with a number of nobles. Now, there are a lot of things they can do when they get there and they're kind of exploring the cusp of sunrise, because this is a really great role playing opportunity. There's, you know, for example, they can mingle, they can gamble with some of the people there, they can carouse, perform if they're a bard, they can chat with people. It's also another great opportunity to bring in various rumors. And the adventure doesn't suggest it, but there's a later adventure in Dungeon Magazine 113 in the campaign called The Foundations of Flame, and it introduces some important nobles in the city, which I'll show you here, such as Lord Ankin Taskerhill, for example. And then there's the Vandervoren twins. They're important nobles in the city, and a few others. Lady Ophelia Delern. You know, there's a few of them. There's a chart here of some important NPCs, and this all has to do with a later adventure. But introducing some of these NPCs that might be here, um, for one reason or another, especially like Sky Algerson, for example. She's a Noma sorcerer and also a merchant in the city. Uh, Tygot Nispas is a halfling merchant who the player characters will end up dealing with in another adventure, but it's a great opportunity to introduce some of these characters for the first time and do an expansive role playing segment for this adventure. And they're not mentioned, most of these NPCs at this point, but I feel like they probably should have been, looking back at all that. As they're exploring the cusp of sunrise and they're interacting with different people, they have a lot of little things they can do. But then eventually they'll meet Celeste again the agent of Valanthru, who introduces them to Davric or Davked Splinter Shield, who they're told is the father of Zenith Splinter Shield and two other dwarves. Now, in reality, he's a doppelganger who is a servant of Valanthru, and the player characters won't know this. And the DM should play him off as an excellent liar, or maybe somebody who's magically charmed, so it'd be extremely difficult to realize that what he's saying is a lie. And the reason why is because if you don't have what he's saying seem believable, which it does seem reasonably believable, then the players may not want to go on the quest. They might get a little too distrustful, and it won't work. This adventure won't work very well. So try to have him seem like a a really elderly dwarf who just wants to recover his son, who, well, Zenith basically charged his way into the Underdark to kill evil creatures, and along with an army of dwarves, they all got killed. Zenith went insane, long story short, and then got captured. Anyways, his so-called father is willing to pay the player character several thousand gold to try to go into the Underdark and try to rescue his son. This is obviously a really good quest for this level. Most of these players at this point have they've probably gone into the Underdark a little bit. In one of the earlier adventures, they do reach the edge of the Underdark, or at least a tunnel that would lead them there. However, they're told at this point that that particular passage in the Underdark is not accessible. There's mention of another group called the Stormblades, another group of adventurers who accidentally caved in that entrance and made it within the Malachite fortress, which the players likely went to before. And so there's no, access that way. They have to go to another entrance. Luckily, there is another entrance. Also, mentioning the Stormblades and what they did is a great way of bringing in the Stormblades later as a rival group of adventurers, or perhaps a complex random encounter, maybe in the streets of Cauldron when all hell breaks loose. Perhaps they work for Valantru to some degree. Who knows? So, as the players are given this information, they're told they need to leave the city and head to the east and northeast and find Crazy Jared's hut. And he's essentially a hermit bard who believes himself to be a king. And near his house is a fissure with stairs that lead into the Underdark. And the location they need to get to in the Underdark is about 10 miles away. And their employers here tell the player characters that, although the player characters will have to find their way there. And this adventure, the one weakness I think is it doesn't really explore that so much, so I have some suggestions there. As you're going further in here, the player characters will get the chance to leave the city. And again, this is one of the first times the players will leave the city, and they would have probably left the city in the prior adventure, but only briefly. But they will eventually come back as well. You do have a random encounter table, which works fairly well, as they will be traveling for 2 or 3 days, out into the jungles. And again, it's a mountainous jungle environment. And eventually, they will come to the hut of Crazy Jared. And this is kind of a simple map of the hut. I think I redid it in Dungeon Draft. Crazy Jared is meant to be a 10th level bard. When the players encounter him, he casts a spell and creates a hallucinatory terrain to make his hut look like a castle. And he claims he's King Jared the Fourth, and that that Zenith Splinter Shield bowed to his throne, and he sent his own forces out to aid Zenith into the attack in the Underdark, and everything he's saying is complete nonsense. The players will probably figure that out, that what he's saying is crazy talk. But the important thing is that he's an interesting NPC, and there's the Underdark Fissure nearby, and also that he will shortly, while the players are there, be attacked by a young red dragon named Gotrod, who is the son of a adult red dragon by the name of Hookface or something like that. Anyways, that comes in later. But his attack, there's an attack from the dragon. Here's the image of Crazy Jared and the young red dragon destroying his hut and attacking them. I'd show this image to the players. It's hilarious. And as you go further into the adventure and this situation, you get a little bit of Jared's behavior. Again, he's a great NPC. He's absolutely an absolute loon. But this part of the adventure won't last for very long. It's more of a role playing with a nice little single enemy battle, effectively. But you get some information of what he might know, for example. Not far from his hut is the Pit of Seven Jaws, the fissure that leads into the Underdark. And when they get there, it's kind of just a pit with metal stairs that winds downward, and then it kind of keeps going in a tunnel for about a quarter mile. Inside the pit is a seven-headed cryohydra. The Hydra is in 5th edition, but you might want to find a homebrew version of cryohydras that you can basically spit frost. And you might want to be, as a DM, cautious about this creature since it's in a pit that is quite deep. Just have it be able to at least fire onto the edges of this map when the players do make their way there. And keep in mind, you may have to have it use its reactions constantly because the player characters will likely use the fact that they can hide around beyond the edge of the pit to their advantage. And you want this to be at least a somewhat memorable threat, so use reactions accordingly in this encounter. I will also show this piece of art to them as well. It's not the best piece of art for this adventure, but it does imply that the players are delving down below into the Underdark, at least a little bit. When the players go down into the Underdark, again, this is one of the weak parts of this adventure, really the only weak part. It's about a 10-mile trek to Bal Hamatug, which ordinarily the players could do that in about 4 to 6, maybe 8 hours. But the player characters probably don't know exactly where to go. If they've asked Crazy Jared information, they might get a little bit extra information on how to get there, but he doesn't give them that much information. So there is a chance every hour that they're in the Underdark of an encounter. It's a 10% chance. As they are going down there, though, they're likely to not know at all where they're going. So I would suggest having the players make survival checks to track any tracks in the area, have them come across Underdark runes. You can look online for Underdark runes. They put some out during the Forgotten Realms Grey Box set, I believe. Um, Describe some landmarks, like maybe some rocky formations in the Underdark with like stairs or indications that there's water or symbols of like that might indicate that there are Keatua nearby, like an arrow here or there. Feel free to send them on a little side trek into a dead end. I honestly feel that you should make this part of the adventure longer than the adventure suggests, unless the players happen to have someone in their party that is a guide. I would also throw in someone who maybe an NPC who is a guide. Maybe they encounter a Snifneblin that they're able to hire and lead them there, or maybe someone else. My other suggestion is it's a really good opportunity to use an adventure called the Chasm Bridge. It was a short adventure released in Dungeon Magazine 101. It's like a toll station controlled by ogres and Dwergar, and it's a location that could be really close into this area. They can get information there. They could just encounter things there, but likely it'll put them closer onto the right path. As the players approach Bal Hamatug, they will encounter a Keatua fairy keeper. He's essentially a martial artist or monk, but just you can use, a martial artist from Volo's Guide and give him some Keatua traits. And he's meant to be more of a weird NPC. Players might treat him as just, depending on the group, a hostile enemy that they can kill to take the ferry, but he might be able to guide them. He probably doesn't realize the player characters are hostile yet, unless they're behaving like that, but they will encounter him first. Finally, they get to the fortress itself, which gives you nice information about the different floors, walls, and stores, and all that information. And you get to the map itself. This location, when you get here, there are a few traps in the area. There are some undead in different rooms. Obviously, quite a few Keatuas, and I think most of the Keatuas you can find in 5th edition. The standard Keatuas and the Keatua whips and monitors could be used for the majority of the monsters in this encounter or in this particular adventure. I'll note here's the entrance right here at number 1. Most of these halls are quite narrow. This map, all the squares are 5 feet, which makes it easier to put into Roll20 if you're using that. The main chamber is actually a 3-storied chamber, which might be a little complicated to use, but if you're using it online, you might want to make this as such on Roll20, one big map with all 3 levels. That way you don't have to switch pages left and right, because you probably will otherwise. But it gives the players a lot of different locations. It's a small dungeon crawl overall, but an interesting one, and it's different than the ones the player characters have been to before, which makes it more interesting. There is, I'll note, an Arrhenius who has a fire bow. I made it a flame-tongue longbow, a unique item, which our archer ended up getting his hands on and used for the rest of the campaign. It's a great, unique magic item that the player characters will probably really like. You encounter some prisoners, as there are some jail cells somewhere around here. They're in here. It's probably number 4 here. One of them is a were-rat. Player characters don't know this, of course. The other is an rather evil halfling sorcerer named Chirrit, who wants to get free because he's a prisoner of Keatua. Makes sense. There are more traps, as I noted, and there is a water dragon. Essentially, it's a black dragon named Dorlot, who the players may encounter kind of a variety of different creatures instead of just being Keatua by itself. As the players are going further in, you see the actual Keatua image. It's actually a really nice image from an illustration perspective. There are some Keatua that have a special build to them, not just Keatua soldiers, which could be like just basic Keatua, honestly, from the Monsters Manual. And again, I'm talking about 5th edition. But there are some Keatua as you go in that have actual levels, which might be more complicated to transport into 5th edition. For example, if you get in here, the Irenaeus. The Irenaeus, you could just make a regular Irenaeus unless you want to be a purist and give her more levels or more hit dice. I just made her a basic Irenaeus. As you go further here, if you find an example, here's one. This particular Keatua is an 8th level cleric. I would recommend making this Keatua an 8th level cleric or something similar to that because it makes it a little more interesting. The 5th level cleric in the Monsters Manual is probably a little weak for this build. You could just level up that particular build a little bit and give it some Keatua traits, and that way you don't have to deal with so many of these random spells and all that. But as you're going here, you get a Dwergar, Slave, there's a Mummy. As I said, there's a little bit of Undead, there's some Wraiths in here. Just a little bit of variety from what the players might expect, thinking they're just fighting Keatuas. Here's a Keatua Rogue. You could probably make this individual I don't want to say you could maybe use the spy build or like a bandit captain or something like that, but make it a Keatua. It will probably work fine. The rates right there. Another Keatua image, which is a nice illustration piece. And these draconic fingerlings, which you're going to have to look them up what they were in 3rd edition if you want to use them. They're essentially like animated dragon fingers. They're really weird, but they're a unique creature in this adventure. As you go further in, you get more Keatuas, of course. You get Dorlot, the Dragon Father. Again, it describes it as a large water dragon. I mean, that would essentially be a either a young adult or an adult black dragon. You might want to go with the young adult in this case. This is also the 2nd dragon the players will be fighting in this adventure, if they find it. As you go further in, there's some violet fungi, different things they find. This particular Keatua, you could just make him either a monk or an assassin, unless you want to do a custom build for it. And finally, you get down to the main chamber where you encounter Zenith himself on his throne, where he's both imprisoned and also where he's become insane. Now, Zenith, when the player characters encounter him, is a 10th level dwarven fighter. You could make him some sort of dwarven veteran or a dwarven like advanced warrior. There's a couple of new builds in the new Monsters Manual for 2024 that will work just fine with this. Just something around 10th level that will work for him with, and he's very much tank type character. He's completely out of his mind when the players encounter him, so he's attacking more or less because he thinks they're enemies, thinks everyone's an enemy. I believe he does release an invisible stalker that he has in a little ball. The intention is not to kill him, though. It's the player character should probably try to knock him out and drag him off with them. He does essentially become compliant later on, but it's worth noting that he also gives a little bit of a prophecy when the players encounter him. Maybe when he's attacking them, he says these lines like, "A man in blue will slay you before the year is done," or "You will set your city aflame." These are important things that they're foreshadow what's going to happen later in the campaign. So as a DM, don't forget to kind of add that stuff. Now, finally, once he's captured, the player characters can head back. They should probably have an easier time going back through the Underdark for that 10 miles. Although I would make them make survival checks to make sure they know they're going the right way. Maybe even putting in like a little sidetrack where maybe they cut the wrong direction and go down the wrong tunnel, have an interesting encounter, or maybe even have a little mini adventure on the way. The Underdark shouldn't be just thought of as a quick come and go adventure. It should be something you should show that it's quite dangerous. Eventually, of course, the players get back to the surface. They might have an encounter out on the surface on the way back if you roll for it, and they'll make it back to Cauldron where the adventure will conclude. And the player characters will be paid And once Zenith is in the custody of Celeste and Doppelganger, who is posing as his father, eventually he'll end up in the hands of Valantru. Now, Zenith is a Shackleborn, like there was a young man, the very first adventure, who Valantru shows up at the end of the adventure as in his beholder form and takes a young man captive. He does so because that individual has a mark on his leg, I believe, and is involved in a larger plot within the city of Cauldron that comes out later in the campaign. And Zenith Splinter Shield is also a Shackleborn. He's got this weird symbol on him, and he's essentially descended from Demodans through a long lineage from thousands of years before. And there are a number of those individuals that show up in this campaign who are part of the plot of one of the latter adventures in the campaign, which conclude the whole campaign. But for now, the player characters are just having their second encounter with one of the Shackleborn, although they probably won't know it just yet. Now, overall in this adventure, I think it has some slight issues with how it handles the Underdark. It kind of passes the Underdark by like it's not a big deal, but it probably should be expanded a bit. It has a lot of good role playing opportunities. It has different types of encounters. It has going from out of the city and then into the Underdark, which is a change of pace. And then again, the dungeon crawl in the very end is a very different design from prior dungeon crawls that we used in the campaign, and it's fairly interesting. There are a lot of variety in the adventure, and it does provide a variety of different creatures they can encounter as well, including one or two that are very unique for third edition. But again, if you're playing in fifth edition or another edition, you can probably convert them. Overall, I like the variety of it, and so I rate this adventure a 5 out of 5, essentially as good as Flood Season, which is the prior adventure, and one of the best adventures in this entire campaign.